The teaching of Jesus today in the Holy Gospel is one of the hardest to keep and one of great challenge. In order to understand it in context, we must look at salvation history. And we see from the first reading in Genesis that Adam names the animals, and yet none of all this marvelous creation was a fit mate for him. And so the Lord puts him in a deep sleep, takes a rib and closes it up and fashions woman. And we have then the first marriage. Marriage existed throughout all of human history, and the family unit remains the basic unit in society. Jesus comes along, and his first miracle is performed at Cana, at a wedding feast, where he changes water into wine, prefiguring the changing of wine into his very blood in the Eucharist. Jesus raises the state of marriage to a sacrament, and a sacrament is an unbreakable bond which cannot be undone. One cannot be unbaptized, one cannot be unconfirmed, the bread and wine cannot be changed back into bread and wine after the consecration, and so on. And so in a valid marriage consent, in a valid marriage, it cannot be undone. Why? According to the great spousal analogy, the wife is a symbol of the church, and the husband is the symbol of Christ. Obviously, this analogy breaks down somewhat because no wife is a perfect model or symbol of the church as a spotless bride, and no husband is a perfect symbol of Christ. Therefore, it's a lifelong process to become such. Patience and mercy, then, must be an essential ingredient of every marriage, keeping in focus that Christ is the center of this union. In my ministry at times, some women have said to me, and others have said, Father, St. Paul doesn't get it right, especially in Ephesians 5, where St. Paul says, wives, be submissive to your husbands. We don't understand what St. Paul is saying, because on the surface, it just doesn't seem right. What St. Paul is saying is that this scriptural passage from Ephesians calls husbands to love their wives as Christ loved the church. And as Christ came not to be served, but to serve, what is understood by St. Paul is, in its proper context, wives, submit to your husbands actually means, wives, allow your husbands to serve you. Gentlemen, take it to heart. That's what it means. Christ is a servant, and you are the symbol of Christ who loves his church, and then who loves your spouse. Marriage is not only one of the 7 sacraments, but it is a model of all the sacraments because it prefigures the union of Christ with his church. And the goal of all the sacraments and the goal of Christian life itself is to unite the bridegroom Christ with his bride, the church, and to fill the church with divine life. So in the theology of Blessed John Paul II and the theology of the body, celibacy complements marriage. Marriage here and now for us, a couple committed in a sacrament, shows us in a symbolic way the love of Christ for his church. Celibacy shows and reminds us that in heaven there will be no giving in marriage or taking in marriage. There will only be the existence with God. And so both lifestyles, celibate or single lifestyle and the married state, are meant as Christians to witness to Christ. Further, Blessed John Paul II says that the body has a language that is meant to proclaim the mystery of Christ's free, total, faithful, and fruitful love. This is precisely what the spouses promise at the altar. Marital union, then, is meant to be a renewal of the marriage commitment, and it is expressed not with words, as Blessed John Paul says, but with the theology and the language of the body. That is why contraception is an evil. Think of the very word, contraception. It's a negative word. Contra means against conception. Now, the church is not so naive and so unreasonable as to think that every family can have 4, 5, 6, 8, 11 children. It's not what the church asks of married couples. The church asks married couples to be responsible. And if they need to limit the number of children in their family, they are to do so by the natural law, by natural family planning, which I'm told in our workshop by a father who had 8 children, 6 of his own and 2 adopted ones, that properly used natural family planning is 99% effective. And you see, but it requires a sacrifice. It requires just a little more than popping a pill and going against God's nature. It was further pointed out in our workshop that if we had been attentive in 1968 to the prophecy of Pope Paul VI in Humanae Vitae, we would not be in this moral dilemma now, which has gone from mere contraception to sterilization, to abortion, and all these other evils that are not of the natural law. And so this is an opportunity when we reflect on the Lord's words to reflect on what marriage is really about. Divorce is just accepted anymore as commonplace. I've said before, sometimes it's necessary when there's an abusive husband or an abusive wife or great difficulties, they have to be separated. But the attitude more and more is, well, if it doesn't work out, I can just get a divorce, move on with my life. That's not what a sacrament is about. We don't move on beyond the sacrament. We allow the sacraments, all of them, to influence our lives, and by the grace of the sacraments to live as Jesus would have us live. It's a difficult teaching. It's a challenge. But the Lord has also said, who would be my disciple must take up his cross and follow me. So we pray for God's grace, and no matter what our state of life is, that we be his faithful witnesses, remaining faithful to the life to which he has called us.